Hello, everybody. And first of all, thanks so much to Barry for organising this event. I do think that our series of events is really helping, members who maybe would like to be more involved to understand how we're feeling in the Green Party. And also, I'm really heartened as somebody who's been an active member of the Green Party for over 15 years. I've never felt that the West Oxfordshire Green Party was as connected to the other Green parties in the county as now. And we are incredibly lucky tonight to have Sue Roberts from Wallingford, who's a councillor on South Oxfordshire District Council, and who is the deputy leader. Is that right, Sue? Yes? No, you were.
I was, but
outdated biography. Sorry. And Ian Middleton, both a county councillor and Cherwell District Council, who's recently been making waves in Oxfordshire County Council in particular. And then our own Andrew Prosser on the West Oxfordshire District Council, who's also a Wheatley town councillor. And so such incredible examples, all of them, of what can happen if we elect more Green councillors and, what can change. And tonight we're tackling an issue which, housing, it just couldn't bring in more of the things that are sort of key to the Green Party: justice, energy, transport, schools, and of course, the balance between our respect for the natural world and our care for our fellow human beings. And so I think what we're going to do first, is that right, Barry, is we're going to watch a film which does show exactly what people's concern. In fact, that list that I just read out is what I wrote when I was watching that film this afternoon. And it shows, what a difficult topic it is. Is there anything? I think are we ready to watch the film? Should we go ahead with it?
Fingers crossed. I'm going to click on it now, and hopefully we'll switch over to YouTube. Hopefully. Put it on full screen. Can you see that and hear it?
No, not yet.
Any sign?
No.
Okay, I'll stop sharing and I'll share another screen. Can you see now?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yeah. Here we go. Can you hear it?
Can't hear it. It's so beautiful.
Before and after.
You might have to do the commentary, Barry. I don't know that we'll be able to hear it.
Is that a Woodstock?
Oh,
yes.
Whoa. Still no sound, but it's very visual.
Yes.
I'm going to stop it. Can you hear the sound or not?
No. Maybe you could put subtitles on, Barry, if we can't get the sound to work.
That's an idea.
Subtitles.
I think it's that one down there, next to the red cog thing.
I think there's a setting in Zoom when you share to share sound as well.
In Zoom. Okay. How do I share? Sorry about this.
What?
Obviously, I've been listening to it. Any idea, Ian, how to share the sound?
I was just having a look myself, actually. I can't see any setting.
Somebody's put Kathy's put a note in. Share sound has special button on screen share. Yes, you have to go back to screen share.
Okay. So stop screen share. And then share screen.
Yeah, bottom left, there's a share sound button
Isn't it?
in the share screen bit.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I'll just bring it back a little bit because you might as well hear the birds.
Hmm. Oh, yes. Can hear the birds now, yes.
I suggest we all mute.
The local plan inspector's report indicated that Woodstock could accommodate around 600 new homes. If passed, there will be 730 new homes built by Blenheim.
Very quiet, Barry.
Across 3 enormous
Yeah.
developments. Already, Blenheim have 300 homes.
It's on maximum.
under
So I just have to be quiet.
construction near the Bladen roundabout. There are 2 more applications for vast developments in Woodstock, for 250 homes at Banbury Road and for 180 at our site of Hill Rise.
These are the latest proposals in a tedious onslaught to spoil the historic town of Woodstock and its surround.
It will bring almost 1,800 new residents. That's a 41% increase in the population.
No way, 41%. It's disgusting.
The application
Simon, can you mute?
Banbury Road site is for 250
Mute. Ah, try.
180 homes allocated in the consultation. If this is agreed, we would already be near the figure of 600 outlined by the local plan inspector. Woodstock does not have the infrastructure to cope with the extra influx of residents. The surgery is already bursting at the seams. Right now, the ratio of patients to GPs already exceeds government guidelines by 467 patients. With the new bills, there will be an unmanageable 2,714 patients for each GP at the surgery, if there is no expansion of it. And the site is not suitable for expansion, as stated by Oxford NHS Clinical Commissioning Group in its objection. Finding somewhere to park in the historic town centre is already a major challenge. People simply drive on to shop elsewhere. Likewise, the schools do not have capacity for all the additional children. Woodstock Primary School is already full. The planning application for Hill Rise indicates that most of these children could go to Wootton Primary School, yet that school does not have capacity to accommodate all of them. And for those that do get places at Wootton, how are they going to get to school?
We live in Old Woodstock, and we've got twin boys, and they went to Wootton Primary School. You can't walk on the road because there are no pavements. It's a very busy road. And the other way you could potentially walk would be across the fields, but that's agricultural land, which is often very muddy, sometimes ploughed. You go through one field and then you get to a very busy little road, Stratford Lane, which is basically a rat run. When you're trying to get somewhere and then having to do that 4 times a day, no, not with little children, absolutely not. children didn't have any friends in Woodstock until they went to secondary school. And when they were in, the difficulty with them was they were kind of outsiders in Wootton because they didn't live in Wootton, and outsiders in Woodstock because they didn't go to school in Woodstock. So it was always quite a tricky situation. So because the children went to school in Wootton, all of their social lives has happened in Wootton and the villages, and because of that, so has most of ours.
The proposed access to the site off the busy A44 is dangerous. The inspector of the local plan did not identify traffic problems on the A44. He also assumed that residents would happily walk into town.
I lived in a cottage on Manor Road, which is actually the A44, and we lived there for 13 years, and it was a lovely cottage and we were very happy there. But when I was pregnant with our second child, I really began to worry about the road in particular, and I was worrying about pushing a pram with a newborn in it and my toddler on a buggy board, and sort of navigating those narrow paths down the hill. And I just had images of my daughter throwing herself off the buggy board and me having to make a decision about grabbing her, letting go of the pram, you know, going downhill. And it sort of really concerned me, and actually that was a factor in us moving away from Old Woodstock.
So there are two main pinch points on Manor Road with regards to taking children safely down the road. The first is in the narrow bit outside number 75, 77. I've seen two HGV trucks bash into each other with their wing mirrors, and the glass and everything went everywhere.
And there's been a few times where the lorries sometimes mount the curb, and I have been there when they have mounted the curb, and luckily I was on my own and not with a double buggy. But if you're with a double buggy, my experience as well is that with the children, they just like to run on down the hill. You can't always hold their hands because they're just kids and playing and running.
It's treacherous, really. It's so busy. The traffic it flows so quickly. So it is a bit hairy every time I take that journey down. If I come across anybody that's in a wheelchair or a buggy, one of us has to go into the road, and it's easier for a buggy to go into the road. So those poor babies are being put at risk because the pavement isn't wide enough for the pedestrians.
Well, when I first started cycling, the only access that one has to the countryside, if you want to cycle in the countryside, is along the A44. And when I first started cycling, I saw how dangerous it was. If you're coming up the hill, cars or vans or even HGVs will overtake you, and they'll soon find that the road narrows at two pinch points, which means that cars coming down the hill in the opposite direction will squeeze the car overtaking me, and the car overtaking me will then have a choice between either avoiding the car coming down the hill or avoiding me.
There is no easy way around this problem. The road and paths cannot be widened here. Suggestions to take a foot and cycle path across the fields and water meadows towards the school won't work either. They are prone to serious flooding, as you might expect of water meadows. So is the adjacent land near Owen Mumford. This area was flooded from December to April this year. In 2019, an application for planning permission to build 2 homes adjacent to number 1 Hill Rise was refused on appeal, largely on grounds that it would have a negative impact on the setting of Blenheim Palace as a World Heritage Site. Now Blenheim want to build 180 houses in the same area. They are asking the District Council to pass an application for 180 houses on the very field right next to the refused site.
It is in the local plan, but careful reading of the inspector report shows great reluctance to develop in Woodstock. His concerns were damage to heritage assets, and he was right to be concerned. Another inspector in 2004 had said Woodstock could not cope with more than a small 64-dwelling development, as larger proposals were too much for the infrastructure. Nothing's changed. If anything, Woodstock has less facilities than in 2004. Woodstock is internationally known, and it's a jewel in West Oxfordshire's crown. Please listen to those who know and love the town and keep it that way.
Yeah. So I hope that gives you a feel for what one town has in Woodstock, in Oxfordshire. Up and down the county, other towns are fighting the same problems of rampant house development, mainly for profit.
Yeah.
So I'm going to now take over the chair, if that's okay, Rosie, and ask whether Sue would now give her presentation.
Yes, I'll try sharing screen, shall I?
Please.
Have you got that?
I can see it. I think everyone can.
Brilliant. Good, good, good. Well, that was heartrending. And of course, it is what we're experiencing in every part of the country, but especially in this part of the county. I've got a little newspaper cutting somewhere that says that South Oxfordshire, Vale of White Horse and Wheatley are amongst the 10 parts of the country that have built the most houses in the last 10 years. And we ain't seen nothing yet. We've got 100,000 to build. South Oxfordshire's built about 9,000 probably of the 30-odd thousand that it has to build. So it's just going to go completely ballistic. And Wallingford, where I live, have had similar experiences to Woodstock. GPs actually closed the doors to new entrants for several months under, they were told to do so by the clinical commissioning group, because we can't take any more people. And yet we've got 2,500 new people coming into 1,000 new homes shortly. Anyway, I wanted to give some of the, what Barry said at the beginning about what the Greens care about most is biodiversity and climate change. And so I want to put all this in perspective with that. Hence the toad. 30 years ago, an Oxfordshire village in the Chiltern set up what they believed to be the very first toad crossing traffic sign. Every year, locals would take their buckets and fill them up, bucket load after bucket load, with migrating toads and help them safely across the road. How many buckets do they need today? 100? 10? No, not one. The toads have vanished. Roll back 10 years before the toad crossing sign, and I was studying wild rabbits for my Oxford University doctorate. I chose rabbits because they were plentiful and easy to watch. Not so now. Now they're on the red list for endangered species. The size of the catastrophic decline in nature depends on your starting point. This watch list indicator shows an 80% drop in the size of key species populations. That's the number of animals within that species from 1970 to 2010. That is where we had 10 hedgehogs, for example, we would now have 2. But if you go back to an earlier starting point or forward to today, then the losses are far, far greater. The UK ranks near the bottom of all countries for the state of its nature. Oxfordshire, of all the counties in the southeast outside London, has the worst access for people to wild spaces. So what? What has nature ever done for us? Aside from providing clean air, clean water, flood control, the breaking down of waste, local climate control, shade, and tranquility of mind. Well, there is food. There are the pollinators. We are so close to losing our insects. Without pollinators, there would be no fruit and very few vegetables. We would have the wind-pollinated grains, there would be bread, but man cannot live by bread alone. Losing our insects, a vital element of our ecosystem, would be like taking out the crucial supporting block of a Jenga tower. The whole edifice will collapse, which will be fatal to us. We must work fast and furiously to restore swathes of land at the landscape scale. But we are doing the opposite, with a destructive rush to build upon our land for financial gain. Once land has been concreted over, it cannot be restored for nature or used for regenerative farming. Each new town or road bisects a landscape, creating barriers where previously wildlife could flow. Creatures are forced into smaller and smaller islands. As the islands become too small, the new tiny populations become unviable and are quickly extinguished. South Oxfordshire District Council has a plan to build 32,000 homes. That would be a 50% increase in housing over what we had in 2011 when the plan started. This, over a period when the Office for National Statistics projects that a mere 8,000 new households will form. That is, 4 dwellings are to be built for each one that can become a home. Necessarily, 24,000 newly empty homes will be created. It need not be the new homes that lie empty. It might be the Oxford mansions and the chocolate box Chiltern villages that empty out. They are bought by the global wealthy as second, third, fourth homes, or left empty as money boxes. They can't be filled, people aren't there. But won't more homes solve the housing affordability crisis? No. The simplistic demand-supply model does not apply in a near infinite market. House prices do not come down with more houses built. 5 years ago, this huge development of flats at Battersea Power Station was under construction down the road from where my son lived, in a vermin-infested, damp basement shared with other professionals. I suggested he look at buying a studio flat there, but the prices started at an eye-watering £1.3 million. Even if on another planet he could have afforded this, he would not have got a look in. The first tranche of 1,500 flats was sold overnight via Singapore. The flats were not advertised in England. There is only one way to stabilise housing costs, by limiting the market, not by increasing supply. Earlier this month, my letter to The Guardian was picked up and published by the magazine The Week. I laid out 3 solutions. Restrict the buying of all homes, old and new, to those who live in the area, as they have done in New Zealand, India, Vancouver and elsewhere, and as Labour intend, only just for new homes. You can buy a home in Oxfordshire only if you are or intend to become a resident there. Secondly, restrict the sale of all homes, as St Ives has done, although only for new homes, to be for residential purposes only. This would slowly end the problem of housing for investment and reduce the second home ownership problem that prices locals out of their right to shelter. Finally, enable holiday businesses through licensing. There is no end to this. Oxfordshire Plan 2050 is being developed to condemn yet more of your homeland to concrete. The growth-hungry Labour Oxford City Council wants 70,000 more houses on top of the 100,000 houses spawned by the Oxfordshire Growth Deal. This will add up to 3 new Oxfords in Oxfordshire by 2050. New construction destroys nature just when we need to restore it, destroys land for farming just when we face food insecurity in the face of climate change, and it creates more than 1/10 of UK carbon emissions. We need to decarbonise extremely fast, arguably to zero carbon by 2030 to have any hopes of a livable future. 100 tonnes of greenhouse gases are emitted in building each new home and all that is associated with it. Is that a lot? 100 tonnes? Well, yes, it is. It is an amount that would take 5,000 mature trees a year to absorb. And that is for one home only. If we built to the government's target of 300,000 homes a year in England, we would need 1.5 billion trees, a half of all the trees in the whole of the UK working all year. Of course, the trees are already busy absorbing existing emissions. So what should we do? Plant 1.5 billion trees a year somewhere else? No good. These trees need to be 30 years old to take in CO2 at that speed. The Tyndall Centre has allocated a carbon budget to every county, the remaining amount of CO2 we can emit to keep within 1.5 degrees centigrade. The building of 100,000 homes, in accordance with Oxfordshire's Growth Deal, will use up 3/4 of that budget. That leaves us with 2 years of business as usual emissions before we exceed our budget. Meanwhile, the Russia-Ukraine war has highlighted our fossil fuel dependency, and we expect the number of fuel-poor households to more than double, from 4 million to 8.5 million. Our own people are living in cold, damp homes, subject to overheating in the summer, and are now facing a doubling of heating bills. And what horrors will descend on us in the near future? When will we in England see destruction on the scale of the Rhineland flood that killed 250 people? Or a rain bomb like that happening now in Australia, flooding thousands from their homes? And this just 4 weeks after catastrophic flooding put 500,000 people on evacuation alert. How would we fare if the M4 were taken out? Well, maybe not you in West Oxfordshire, but us in South Oxfordshire. And we were left with no food, water, medicines, or communications. The hot summer of 2003 is set to become a norm. It killed 70,000 Europeans over a few days. Will fire descend like the fire a few days ago that destroyed Grenard Island off Scotland? Our climate is similar to British Columbia, which last year saw a heat dome and unprecedented levels of heat and fire, burning down the town of Lytton. Could our woodlands catch fire in Oxfordshire? Professor Richard Harding, my husband and former director for climate change research at the Government Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, says we are moving into a different climate era. Here, flooding is likely. A heat dome could happen. We've made arrangements with our children for when communications are lost. We have a month's worth of food, stored rainwater, highly insulated home with renewable heating and solar power. Everyone needs security and resilience in the face of global heating. We must act urgently to overhaul our homes with insulation and renewables, improve our living conditions, and reduce our carbon emissions. It costs about £40,000 to retrofit a home on average. That is a total of £1 trillion for the UK. Miraculously, that is the same amount conjured up since 2008 through quantitative easing from the government's magic money tree. Money is not a restriction, resources are. We have a shortage of all trades, builders, materials, even for new build, and a practically non-existent supply chain for the intricate work of retrofit. In a nature, climate, and social justice crisis, how do we best deploy our scant resources? To reduce the danger of flood, we must recreate wetlands to let our rivers breathe out. To protect ourselves from overheating in the hot summers and from high heating bills in the winter, and to reduce carbon emissions, we must insulate. So should we move onto a war footing for our fuel security? Should we requisition all builders and materials for street-by-street retrofit? We have 7 months before next winter. We need a goal to insulate and decarbonise, say, 1 million homes by October. Now, that all might sound like it's a bit off-piste for talking about how many houses we need, but the fact is that we need to redeploy all of the workers we've got to face the climate emergency, which we need to keep front and centre of our minds all of the time, rather than mucking about with new homes that are just using up our carbon budget. And if we were to redeploy our homes better by ensuring that they are only used for living in, I think it'd be interesting to see how we get along with our growing population, which isn't growing that fast anymore.
Thank you, Sue.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sue. Well, that was a challenging start to our presentations this evening. Could you take the share off, sorry? Because I'd like to hand over now to Ian, who's sitting in Kidlington, sunny Kidlington it looks like, with a green field behind him. Would you like to make your show your presentation about affordability? And
Okay. Never actually done this before, so I'm just going to try and do it now. Okay, can you see that?
No.
Okay, that hasn't worked then. Hold on.
At the bottom, you've got share screen, then you have to choose your particular presentation.
That one. Oh, no, it's that one. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. That seems to be able to go to. Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah, I'm Oxfordshire County Councillor, District Councillor and Parish Councillor. I'm actually on 3 parish councils. I won't bore you with the reasons for that. I've been involved in, one of the main reasons I got seriously involved in local politics was to oppose a lot of the building on green spaces that Sue was talking about, in particular in Cherwell, which is another one that's on the receiving end of the expansionism of the City Council. We have 4,500 houses that are going to be built here entirely on green belt, and all of them are going to be in my Oxfordshire County Council division. So it's something that's important to me. I'm not an expert on planning or building, but I have been involved in these campaigns for about 5 or 6 years, including contributing to the City Council plan and the Cherwell District Local Plan Partial Review, which was a 4-day public inquiry. So I've kind of had a bit of a crash course in all of this. So I really wanted to go through some of the realities of the planning system. I'm sure many people will know some of the bits. I might be able to fill in some of the gaps. The first issue really is to do with, in terms of affordability, is what we're talking about, are the affordability criteria, the splits and percentages. Each council, I'm concentrating really on the City, South Oxford, Cherwell and West Oxfordshire here, have different percentages for what they require, because we are doing these, I thought putting the devil in development was quite a clever line there, actually, that we are kind of dealing these deals with the devils, who are the planning, the planners and the developers, who we expect to build our affordable housing for us, and in return we allow them to use quite a large percentage of that land to build houses that are by definition not affordable, aren't just market rent. Market value. For the City Council, they determined that it should be a 50-50 split, which is probably the best that you're going to get. South Oxfordshire is a 40% has to be affordable. Cherwell, my council, is 30%. West Oxfordshire is 30% on Wheatley in Carterton and 50% in the remainder of the districts. I'm not quite sure why that's the case, but I'm sure someone will be able to explain that to me later. But these percentages are often negotiated down by developers. For example, Barton Park, which is land that the City Council owned, they've only got 40% affordable housing on that site. The Oxford North development, which is again another city project, which is near Wolvercott, that only has 35%. It's also worth noting that Oxford North is supposed to be creating 4,500 jobs in an economy in Oxfordshire, which is essentially has zero unemployment. With 480 homes, only 168 of those will be affordable. So that kind of explains how broken the City Council's housing policy is. Affordability requirements can also be waived in respect of developers' contributions. The idea being that these affordable units will be built elsewhere, but there's never a guarantee that this will happen. The viability assessments are where all of the problems lie. Essentially, the government guarantees developers a return on their investment of 15 to 20%. I don't know how many of you have been in business and would love to be in the enviable position where somebody guarantees that you'll get a certain amount of profit, but this is exactly what developers have got. So at any point in the process, usually prior to them getting planning permission, but it can happen during the process itself, during the actual work going on even, they carry out viability assessments, which are usually carried out by very highly paid consultants, often the ones that have done the original plan. And they give all these kind of convoluted arguments and algorithms as to why, how much they can afford, which then determines how much they're supposed to pay in Section 106 payments or community infrastructure levy payments, which are slightly the same, almost the same thing, but slightly different. I think Andrew's going to speak about those later. So you end up in a situation where the amount of money, I mean, I've seen a development in my area where the viability, they should have been paying about £1.3 million in developers' contributions. That was bargained down to about 300,000 based on a viability assessment, which I read and looked very convincing. But you know, it's not. The devil is in the detail on all these things. Price setting can have an impact on affordability. It's pretty obvious that if you're on the definition of affordability under the National Planning Policy Framework is that it has to be 80% of the rental value or the house value. So you can see that if you set your own prices on the non-affordable properties, on the market properties, then that will have an impact on the rental or the cost, the value tone of the other houses on the same site. So not surprisingly, developers tend to build the expensive houses first, put those up at a lovely big price, and then argue the prices on the other ones. They can also mess around with their space allocations, and again, this can be on the basis of viability. You know, they can be on site building these houses and then suddenly realise, well, that bit of space we were going to put between those houses, or that bit of green space we were going to have over there, well, now our costs have gone up, we can't afford to make our 20% profit here, so we'll go back to the council and say, well, actually we want to squeeze another house in there, another one there, and that bit of green space we're not going to have anymore. We're also going to reduce the size of the affordable housing, make the bedrooms smaller, and generally councils will acquiesce to that because they know that they're going to lose it on appeal if the developers go and waive their viability assessments at them. And supply and demand really puts that whole thing into context in that it's not in developers' interests to increase the supply of affordable housing or any housing. It's within their ability to say, I'm going to build 1,000 houses on that site and dribble them out at a rate of maybe 100 a year or something like that, because it just keeps the value of housing up. No business is going to flood the market with their goods with the intention that it's going to undermine their own pricing. This is all within the remit of developers. And then just to put the idea of affordability into context, I had the the figures to back all this up, but I took them out because it was getting too long to explain. But take my word for it. The average property price in Oxfordshire at the moment is 466,000. Now that's a 2 to 3 bedroom house. There are cheaper ones. You can probably get a house below £300,000 in Blackbird Leys, but we're generally looking here at small, young families that maybe have one child, another one on the way. Probably don't want to be going into a 2-bedroom house with no garden in an area that's perhaps not particularly child friendly. But a combined salary there, the average salary for women is 34 and for men 36,000. I've ignored their outgoings, and then you can see there the calculations at the bottom in terms of the average ratios that they can get a mortgage on. A 4 times combined salary gives them, that enormous figure, 186,000. 4 times is pretty average. 5 times is becoming more average, but still you would need £116,000 deposit. And then 6 times, there is one mortgage company that's offering a 7 times mortgage, but it locks you into a very, very onerous deal. But at 6 times, you're still left with a £46,000 gap. Perhaps the Bank of Mum and Dad can fill that gap, but it's not by any means affordable, I guess, by the kind of standard that we would believe. Skewing the market, this is where I've kind of become involved in some of this stuff. Sue touched on there that the housing needs assessments. We have the SHMAR, which stands for the Strategic Housing Market Assessment, and the key word in that phrase was market. It looked at what the market would stand, not what the need was, and this was the basis of all the local plans, and still is more or less. And it was hotly debated. It resulted in the postulated need of 100,000 houses between 2011 and 2031 in Oxfordshire alone. It was widely criticised because it added a 40% uplift on the figures that were applied to the figures to account for growth. And most of this was based on unsubstantiated assumptions, leaving Oxfordshire growth figures massively overinflated compared to the rest of the country. And in that picture there, you can see me in the local plan partial review public inquiry for Cherwell, holding up a chart. I had to actually put an extension on that chart to show at the top there, all those red marks, the black bits are the actual assessments of need, the red bits are the uplifts. And you can see from there the massive uplift that was applied to Cherwell of 40%. And I rather hoped in that meeting that me unrolling that extra bit would make the inspector take a sharp intake of breath and then maybe think again, but it didn't work, unfortunately. The next stage of the housing needs assessments, as Sue also alluded to, is the Oxfordshire 2050 plan, which is an overarching strategic plan, which is between all of the local district councils. Quite how it fits in with their own local plans, no one seems to know at this stage, but it takes into account all the strategic needs for housing. In that, there's a new WISO assessment of need called the OGNA, which is the Oxford Growth Needs Assessment. And at least this one has the word need in it. It still has the word growth in it though, and I actually call it the son of SHMAR, because essentially that's what it is. The Office for National Statistics recognised some time ago that the population projections for our areas were wrong because cities with large student populations like Oxford are skewed. They prepared new population projections for Oxford, but the government hasn't allowed these to be used yet and still requires the 2014 projections to be used. The OGNA adds to this. There are 3 levels of growth that are being proposed, and the highest one essentially knocks that 100,000 house figure up to 153,000 houses. And to put that in context, Oxfordshire at the moment has about 280,000 homes in it, and those have taken 1,000 years to get to that stage. We're talking about adding an extra 50% to that inside 30 years. So I think we can see from that how ridiculous that claim is, and it basically sits. It affects councils in the way that councils have to, by statutory requirement, have to have 5 years of land supply for developers. Otherwise, developers can swoop in and say, well, you've not complied with this, and I can pretty much build anywhere. Virtually no local council at the moment, I don't think, has theirs. I know Cherwell's is about 3.5 years. And the amount of growth that's being projected has a massive effect on these figures. And that's why we end up with developers pitching to develop on greenfield sites. And this all basically feeds into the local plans, as I put on there. This then, on top of all this, we have the housing growth deals, which are essentially bribes. And I also refer to them as Ponzi schemes, because they generally are money given by the government to councils to build and infrastructure to plug the gaps that were created by the previous plan. You never get the money to build the infrastructure you need for the plan you've got. You always have the infrastructure, you're always one step behind. So each time councils end up in a situation where they want to comply with all these other things like the 5-year land supply, they also have to pitch for grants from the government to build these extra bits of infrastructure. At the moment, OCC is looking at a £300 million project to build a huge road going through into South Oxfordshire, and something that as Greens we're actually not too keen on, but they are there to unlock the housing in South Oxfordshire, and the two things go together. And they're it's very difficult to resist government on these, because they tie them all up in all sorts of requirements. So you have the housing infrastructure fund, which is what that one is based on. There's the growth deal. Everything is generally pitched towards growth. And then at the sharp end, you have help to buy and shared ownership, which are clever little schemes that are put together to help to buy. Is recognised now as propping up the house value, housing values. It's basically a good way of putting money in developers' pockets from the government's coffers. And shared ownership, which really locks people into houses where they're essentially paying a mortgage and rent at the same time, and they're responsible for a house that they've virtually got no equity in. And I think this is going to be in the future a situation that's going to be another one of these kind of mis-selling scandals that's going to pop up to bite everyone. How did we get here? Well, there's a great video that I wouldn't have the time to show here. There's a channel on YouTube called See This, and it's occupied by a Boris Johnson impersonator who appeared during the Brexit negotiations. He's got a great video on calling why house prices can never come down. It's parody and it is satire, but it is really good explanation of how we got into this situation and why house prices can never come down. I think the problem is there's an elephant in the room, and any sudden crash in house prices would be disastrous for the economy. I know we don't really like that idea, and I certainly don't, but it's the reason why we ended up in a situation where Gordon Brown never put the brakes on consumer credit before the financial crash, even though he was warned that we were heading for that. And the reason that the current government would rather shore up the housing market with public money than see houses fall. Developers and landowners don't want to see prices come down. Homeowners generally don't want to see prices come down, even though many may say they do. Businesses don't want to see it, and the government certainly doesn't, but they can't say that. I mean, we all agree that the housing market is overheated, but turning off the heat suddenly wouldn't work, even if that were possible. It's taken us about 2 generations to get to this situation. It'd probably take us that long to slowly back ourselves out of it if we're not going to end up with an economic collapse. But it's something we must do, but we must do carefully to avoid that economic meltdown and putting millions of people into negative equity. Much as the Greens agree that infinite growth is unsustainable, a steady state economy would be far preferable to the longer term depression. So we have to accept that generation rent is going to be with us for some time, which means we have to address the inequities and the inequalities of the private rental sector, whilst increasing the amount of social housing. If rents are made affordable rather than a major part of outgoing, if tenancies are secure, if rental properties are well built, insulated, cheap to run, that will gradually take the heat out of the housing market. In many countries, the idea of renting permanently is not seen as a disadvantage. Countries like Germany and France prefer to rent, and the prices per square foot are around 1/4 to 1/3 of UK prices. They are moving in the same direction as us, unfortunately. But there are some great examples, like collaborative housing projects in places like Austria, where we've got where 2/3 of the citizens of Vienna live in subsidised local housing. Again, if you've not seen it, Google the Alt-Erla. It's a housing project in Vienna. It's a complex with, they've got their own TV station, high density housing, 10,000 people living in essentially tower blocks, outside tennis courts, swimming pools, inside swimming pools, community centre, and it's guaranteed long-term rental accommodation. So people have lived there for generations, and they absolutely love it. And there's some other suggestions. I've always said, in terms of what can we do to fix the housing crisis, the government could do it at the stroke of a pen. They've just basically flushed away £14 billion down a drain for COVID, and no one knows where it went. That money could easily have been used to build social housing, rebuild council housing, which was the sort of mainstay of our social housing in this country for years. Once you've built the housing, I mean, the land, councils have land, if they're allowed to use it. You can give yourself planning permission, build the houses. After about 25 years, the houses are essentially free, because you've got back your cost of building them with reasonably modest rentals. So, rather than keep doing these deals with private developers who, really just don't want to build affordable housing and want to build on land that could be used for farming and other uses, which, as Sue says, is very important for our future. Let's, refund council housing, social housing, and also take away right to buy, which I think was the thing, that the little ruse that we all know that Margaret Thatcher brought in, because once you give people a house and you give people a mortgage, they can't go on strike anymore. Community housing, land trusts are a great idea. I was involved in a land trust in Oxford a few years ago. Basically, people buy a piece of land, build houses on it, and it's then owned by the community. Very similar to a cooperative. They seem to have fallen out of favour of late. I'm not sure why, but I'd like to see more cooperatives. I lived and helped set up one of the largest purpose-built housing cooperatives in the country in the 80s. It's now under the car park of the Olympic Stadium, but it was a very good one. It lasted. They can work. Sometimes they can be difficult to operate, but they are, a good idea. And I think also, as Sue touched on, sustainability equals affordability. The affordability of a house isn't just what you pay for it; it's how much it costs to run it, and how much it's going to cost you in the long term. So I think it's very important that we do sort of push for that as well. And just a few closing ideas there. The usual. I mean, I'm sure we all agree with this. We need houses close to the jobs, so that we don't end up with a situation of commuter belts that the city council are trying to push on the local districts at the moment. The 15-minute cities idea is another thing that we're trying to push in the county council, so you have everything within 15-mile distance in terms of walking or cycling. Car-free developments, the idea of car clubs, transport hubs, and active travel, which I think is something we all agree with. And of course, the kind of golden thing is build communities and homes, not investment vehicles. And I think that's me. So thanks for listening, and I think we'll take questions later.
Yes, thank you, Ian. Could you stop sharing? Sorry.
Yep. That
was really an in detail introduction to all the things that are going on behind the scenes that you councillors have to deal with. And it's one of the things I want to do at the end, and Ray is going to sum things up, but I'll steal a little bit of thunder and say how grateful I am that we've got councillors who are prepared to take the time to get in there and fight for what we know is right. And the other thing that Ian mentioned is that at the end of this, we'll have a question and answer session, and we're going to base it on the questions that you put into the chat. So if you have a question to ask of Ian, of Sue, or Andrew, or of anyone, please put them in the chat, and we'll put them to the panel of the three speakers in the next session. But for now, we're going to move over to Andrew Prosser. Andrew, are you there?
I am there. Thank you, Barry.
And are you able to share your screen, your presentation?
Not at the moment. I've got your screen, Barry. So can you try sort of sharing, give me the rights again?
Andrew, go find you in the list. Where is Andrew? Andrew Prosser. Oh, you are a co-host.
Actually, it's okay. I think I'm. Can you see that?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. So, thanks very much again to Sue earlier. Really good presentation, and enjoyed that. And Ian, really informative as well. So, what I'm going to talk about is infrastructure. So, basically, in terms of new housing, with that housing, we're supposed to get infrastructure and services to support that housing. And I'm going to talk through really quickly. As Ian was saying, in terms of his experience working on the planning system, the planning system is really complex. I've only been involved for 3 years on the planning committee, and I'm definitely still learning, and I've just learned quite a bit from Ian and Sue there as well. So I'm going to go through really quickly, basically infrastructure, how it's funded, how it's phased in, and also its environmental impact. So basically, when we think of infrastructure, a lot of the time we think about, and a lot of the criticisms about infrastructure relate to travel, to poor transport infrastructure. But of course, the infrastructure and services is about many other things as well. So it's about education, it's about schools, and within Oxfordshire, in terms of the Oxfordshire's plan, Ian mentioned it before, that there is a plan to 2050 for Oxfordshire, where basically they're trying to plan in all the infrastructure. Also within each of the districts, they have their own local plan. And these really set the scene in terms of local infrastructure that has to be put in place with new housing and developments. And it really is, it can get quite complex. I mean, there's a list from the Oxfordshire's infrastructure strategy of all the different types of infrastructure, from energy, transport, through to wastewater and emergency services, and how they support these general needs, in terms of the environment, in terms of health, place shaping, productivity and connectivity. One that's actually missing there is, I've been pushing for this in the sort of revised local plan for West Oxfordshire, is food. Land management in terms of food. That is becoming so important with the climate change, as Sue was talking about. But that's one area which doesn't really get enough of a look in terms of planning for infrastructure around the county and around districts and parishes. And some of you were on that excellent set of talks we had that were hosted. Rosie hosted the other week, looking at community food, producing food in the community. But that is one of the areas which doesn't really get much of a look in at the moment in terms of infrastructure. But all the other areas, I'm sure you're familiar with those. And basically, how are they funded? How are they brought forward in terms of new housing developments? So the funding for this infrastructure, in terms of national infrastructure, but also going into local authority infrastructure, there's strategic, what may be called capital infrastructure, and the funding for that can be, broadly speaking, either from public funding, which can come from taxation, from government raising money through bonds or the magic money tree, as was mentioned earlier, and that funding can go through that can come direct from government departments in central government. There are a huge number of quangos out there that some of these have been mentioned already. I think the HIF, the Housing Infrastructure Fund, that there's a quango behind that. There's local enterprise partnerships around the country. There's a huge number of these quangos that also government sort of directs funding through as well. But the other area, of course, in terms of infrastructure is from the private sector. And as we well know, a lot of our public goods have fallen into private hands over the years, including telecommunications, water, and energy. And these organisations are also supposed to fund infrastructure as well. And as we know, clearly in the case of water, which has been highlighted particularly in recent years, that investment has not been taking place. Not enough investment has taken place in terms of that private infrastructure as well. The other broad group is, in terms of infrastructure funding, comes from developer contributions. So that's linked to specific housing developments that are taking place, and basically the infrastructure can be put in place through either through planning conditions. So if a new housing development is as it's going through the planning system, the planning authority, usually the district council or the city council, can put in place certain conditions, certain infrastructure that has to be built as part of that new housing. But a lot of it is actually sort of funded through what are called obligations. Again, it was mentioned in Ian's talk, Section 106 agreements, and also Section 278 agreements. They are basically, if a housing development is taking place and new infrastructure is required, perhaps off-site, new schools or a new pavilion, sports pavilion, or new roads, that may be funded through these agreements that are basically negotiated between the planning authority and the housing developer. And as Ian said earlier, that is a negotiation. So the developers are obviously trying to reduce their costs of their investment to maximise their profit, and obviously the local community through the local planning authority, through the planners and the councillors are trying to maximise the sort of gain, the infrastructure and services that comes with that housing development. But it's always, again, as Ian mentioned, in a lot of cases, it's always a step behind. A lot of the funding comes through. One of the big reasons we don't have good enough infrastructure is it's always be a step behind. So when you do get that new infrastructure, you've probably got to have thousands of houses coming with that infrastructure. So you're increasing the demands on those services and infrastructure in your area. The other thing, again mentioned earlier, is community infrastructure levy, called SIL in short. Basically, this is used in different areas in different ways. Some local authorities have this levy on all areas of housing developments. I'm just going to talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. So, yeah, just in terms of Section 106 agreements, coming back to these obligations that are put in place, these agreements are negotiated on a site-by-site basis. The negotiation is around, is it required? There are guidelines in terms of national planning guidance and also the local plans for local authorities that says the type of infrastructure that has to accompany these housing developments. But there's always a negotiation. And one of the reasons in the past why we don't always get the right infrastructure is sometimes development is piecemeal, a small housing development and separate from other developments, and they may come to a negotiation in terms of what they're going to pay in terms of Section 106 agreements to fund new infrastructure, but it's a separate unit, and basically that money needs other money to come in from other housing developments. So sometimes it doesn't always match together, and sometimes it's not right for the development. So what local authorities have tried to do is to bring smaller housing developments together into strategic developments where they can get a better sort of plan for infrastructure for a wider area and a bigger number of houses. But one of the drawbacks with Section 106 agreements is they're specific to that development. So sometimes they can be written for a specific road or piece of infrastructure. And we had the example in, if anyone's familiar with Wheatley, back 10 years ago, there was a big housing development, Madley Park was built, and the Section 106 agreement included money to build a link road from that development across the water meadows to the Sainsbury's superstore, and that was written into the Section 106 agreement. But what happened was that that needed compulsory purchase of land. And there was a big campaign against building, rightfully against building across this water meadow. And the inspector, the planning inspector, turned it down. And basically that meant, because it was that money, which was about £5 million, was only meant for that specific road link, that money was lost. So that money had to go back to the landowner and the developers. So that's one of the drawbacks of Section 106 agreements. But I think local authorities are getting a bit smarter with them and try to be a bit more flexible in the wording that they put for the infrastructure that goes in place. Yeah, just quickly back to community infrastructure levy. It's effectively a development tax on floor area. So the idea, particularly for smaller housing developments as well, is that you would pay a fee, and it depends on the size of the development and the number of houses. The developer would pay a fee from anything from £100 to £300 per square metre, and it goes into a general fund for local authorities to tick off things in their wish list of infrastructure. So that's another way that money comes into local authorities. So just quickly here, I mean, we're all in the business of looking at environmental impact, and as Sue was saying at the start, there are real big concerns about the environmental impact of huge numbers of houses being built. I'm just talking about the infrastructure. When you're looking at the infrastructure, for example, if you're building 1,000 new homes, typically those 1,000 homes would be expected to come with around about 1.5 cars each, 1.4 cars each. So in effect, if you're building that new housing estate, you're adding 1,400 cars onto the roads, and you need to find spaces for parking for all those cars. So that automatically has a huge impact. Of course, we'd be looking from an environmental point of view at more less cars, car sharing and public transport, but that's the reality. Those are the kind of formula that they planners look at when they're building new developments. Water, sewage, we're all aware of the big issues on that. Every 100 homes will create, every 100 new houses will create in the order of 30 tonnes of extra sewage per day. And if that's going into a sewage system, which already does not have capacity to deal with the households in the area, that's going to go into the rivers. So it's that kind of calculation that you have to make when you're looking at new housing developments. The reason why sewage capacity hasn't kept pace with our demands in the region is because the privately owned water companies have what I think would be described as sweated the assets. So they haven't invested enough in the sewage infrastructure they haven't put in place new capacity, and they've tried to maximize as much money from new householders coming into the area, but with creaking infrastructure, leaky drains and pipes, and capacity that's far too low. So that's why we're really struggling with sewage problems around the whole country. And the other reason for that is poor regulation. So I mentioned earlier government quangos, but for the privately owned, shall we say, public sector utility companies, they're all regulated by organisations like Ofwat, Ofgen, and they're supposed to put in place formula of investment for infrastructure for those companies in that industry, and that hasn't been done effectively in the past. That's another reason why we've really had big problems in terms of creaking infrastructure. So, yeah, I won't go into the detail around all these points, but of course, environmental impacts, land use change, as Sue was saying, if we're building big new housing developments, we're losing potentially productive farmland. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be building any new houses, but that's a consideration we've got to plan into to feeding our communities in the future. You know, what land's available for growing food locally. Embodied emissions, basically all the materials, all that huge amount of concrete, tarmac, plastic pipes, cables, all has enormous carbon emissions embodied into it from the energy of producing those, particularly things like concrete. They're very carbon intensive to build, and those industries are slowly going to reduce the decarbonize, but at the moment it's a huge sort of one-off carbon when you put them in place. And then you've got all the construction energy for lorries and vehicles and all that energy going in as well. And then of course, once they're in place, these developments have all the ongoing operational emissions, maintenance, pollution, water runoff, heat ion effects from roads, from tarmac, etc., etc. So why is, I mean, I've touched on some of these issues, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but you know, why is housing being built without the necessary infrastructure? First one, I think really is, it's been mentioned again in terms of the housing supply, the pressure for local authorities to put in place that have targets for numbers of houses in our region. And this puts pressure to get developments approved as part of that negotiation, sometimes without, you know, an agreement for sufficient infrastructure to be put in place. I would say our local planning officers, particularly in West Oxfordshire, do a really good job in terms of their negotiations, and they don't have a huge amount of resource, but they do, you know, that's their job. They do sort of squeeze out some good agreements with developers, but there's always that pressure to reach the targets, and that sometimes means cutting corners in terms of you know, reaching the agreement with the developer. The phasing in terms of so basically, if you're building a new housing development, obviously to build that in the first place, you need certain basic infrastructure put in place, and you need to get lorries, deliveries into that building. That stuff gets built early on, but we do have cases where I know the housing development I mentioned earlier about the Cogs link in Wheatley, Madley Park. It took 6 years before they put in all the roads to start with, but it took 6 years before they joined up all the footpaths and the cycle routes to town. So by that stage, everyone had got in the habit of driving into town. So the phasing, you know, at what point different points of parts of infrastructure come in, that's really important, and that can be a reason why certain infrastructure doesn't appear or appears too late. Obviously, the complexity level of planning. It's a complex, that there are so many different things of infrastructure to look at. It's not easy, and things, you know, we don't, you know, our needs, our demands, the world is changing. You know, there are certain things of infrastructure that weren't needed in the past, like electric charging, for instance. You know, the digital communications weren't so important 30 years ago, or so the type of infrastructure has changed, and it's complex. Yeah, as you know, public sector austerity in terms of funding, diminished central government funding, private sector incentives, money squeezed out of these private companies. You may have heard about the National Grid selling off to Macquarie, a Australian previous investor in Thames Water, and they squeeze money out. They sweat the assets and they squeeze money out. And unless government regulates very effectively and strongly, we're not going to get the infrastructure. That's not going to be built sufficiently. The kinds of funding formula that are put in place and economic hurdles, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of things like parking, there are certain formula that says how much how many parking spaces you're supposed to put in place, what type of roads and infrastructure you're supposed to put in place. These aren't always updated enough, and that can mean that infrastructure's not sufficient as well. The other thing I think is cumulative effects. So if we take the example of loss of permeable areas, so people tarmacking over their front gardens, or people building extensions to their buildings, each individual planning application doesn't necessarily seem to have a big impact, but that all adds up. That cumulative effect can mean that you have, for example, you can have huge amounts of water runoff, and with water runoff increased so much, you need new infrastructure, more sewage capacity, more drainage capacity to deal with that. And again, the complexity of planning, a lot of these things aren't necessarily sort of built in from the start. So that's another reason there. Like I say, there are, perhaps we can discuss a few more of these points after I finish these slides, but this isn't an exhaustive list, but these are some of the problems that mean we don't get enough infrastructure in place. So just to finish on not a completely positive note, because it's not perfect, but there are improvements. I mean, planners, the planning system is trying to become more climate friendly, to take account of the huge challenges that we have to reduce carbon emissions, and to look at improving our biodiversity. Obviously, it's not doing it perfectly or quick enough for what we want or need, but there are some steps, in terms of plans for future developments, that are being improved. Now, close to Ensham is the Saltcross Garden Village. It's unfortunately a lot of, I think, 3,500 houses, I think, coming. It's anything but sustainable for the planet, but it really does have a much better sort of strategy in terms of phasing in more sustainable infrastructure. And the inspector has recently gone through the inspection process, looking at the plans for how this development is built. And the planning inspector actually sent the local authority back to the drawing board to come up with a stronger phasing strategy to integrate the public transport and the incentives for walking and cycling in much more effectively. And that is happening. There are improvements, there are developments that are taking place much more effectively now, but there aren't enough. There are still too many housing developments that are pushed through too quickly and with too shoddy infrastructure and service requirements around them. But there is hope, and it's definitely improving in some areas, but there's a lot of work to do on infrastructure. And yeah, hopefully we can talk about some of those issues now. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Andrew, if you could stop sharing your screen. Well, while you've been chatting, Andrew, at the top there should be, I can see your cursor moving around.
Yeah, let's try and get that off.
No, that's is it, as you go to the very top of your screen, a green panel should come down, green and red panel. It says stop sharing.
Got it.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, 3 very different presentations and 3 very important aspects of the housing issue that need to be addressed. And it made me realise how much we need more green councillors on all levels of our council. People who will put their time and effort into making things change for a better, fairer, greener future. Now we're going to go over to question time now. And are you happy with taking that over, Rosie? There have been a fair number of questions put into the chat while we've been talking. Are you there, Rosie?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I think I can summarise. I've been watching the chat, so I think I can see put the questions into certain groups. Shall I go ahead with that?
Yes, please.
Right.
So it's up to Sue, Andrew, and Ian to try to answer these, and I'll leave it up to you, Rosie, if you want to bring anyone else into the discussion.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll go in order because there are some, in terms of, obviously some are addressed to everybody and some, the ones, so regarding Sue's presentation, I mean, there are some very general questions which, you know, I think everyone is feeling, gosh, what can we do? Where is the bridge between, you know, all this information and what can we do about it? So Cathy, I think it is, has said, you know, how do we get a broadcaster interested in making a programme about this desperate situation? Sue, are you okay if I do sort of 2 or 3 questions for you and then, Celia, more specifically, is asking whether local authorities actually can introduce the restrictions you mentioned on house sales, restricting sales to local people and the houses have to be lived in. Is that, you know, are there legal hurdles for that? Then the other one that was specifically for Sue is what legislation exists. No, sorry, that's for everybody actually. The one with the other, no, okay, then moving on to Ian's presentation. No, actually, yes, so Sue, if you can do those 2 first, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's possible to restrict sales of houses old and new. I think it 90% unlikely. Or in St Ives and in other places, I think in Cornwall and Devon, they've locally managed to restrict sales of new homes only. And I presume that's because they've managed to put it into their local plan. So that's where they get their influence. But it's not good enough. So when I talk to people about this and say, isn't Cornwall wonderful, isn't St Ives wonderful? People from there say, no, it's been a complete failure. What it has meant is that no new houses are being built at all. So there's no new housing for the locals who thought they were going to get them because the local plan have written it in that way. Which just goes to show that the developers are building for a non-local market for non-residential purposes, and they can't get the huge uplift in money otherwise. I've no idea how we get a broadcaster interested. I have tried, but then we should get together. So Ian and I were both back in 2018, I think. I set up a housing group for the Green Party in Oxfordshire, really to thrash out some of these things, because a lot of people didn't know the myths that were myths, like that we need 100,000 houses in Oxfordshire. And someone did ask, actually, how many houses do we actually need, which is what I was supposed to talk about. We need about 30,000 in Oxfordshire. During the period that the growth deal insisted that we had to build 100,000, we could only fill 30,000 new homes. So 60,000, 70,000 are being built, and 70,000 homes will become empty as a result. They have to, and people say, but aren't they coming in from London or somewhere like that? The Office for National Statistics takes everything like that into account when it comes up with how many new households will be, or how great our population is. And one of us talked about how the 2014, I think it was Ian, 2014 data, we're not allowed, we have to use the 2014 projections from the Office for National Statistics to decide how many houses we have to build. We're not allowed to use the most up-to-date statistics. That's because as time has gone on, every time we've looked at the growth rate of the population, it has gone down. That's true of the whole of England. We thought we were going to have more people, and then each time they look at it again, every 2 years, it's fewer more people than they thought it was going to be, if you get my meaning. That's me.
And then there's the issue Simon mentions of brownfield sites, of why, you know, we can't use more brownfield sites to cope with the housing need that is there. Sue, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, and someone else asked, are green fields protected and is agricultural land protected? Agricultural land is not protected. Greenbelt is supposed to have protections. Areas of outstanding natural beauty are supposed to have supposed to be built on only in exceptional circumstances. It's much, much nicer for the developers to have a lovely green place to build on. When strategic sites are being allocated in the local plan, you can't just pick out 10 houses here and 4 houses here. Great big 3,000 house sites have to be allocated because we're being told to build such stupid numbers. So it's going to be those things. And the Greenbelt and the AONB, you can't build in when you're allocating them in the local plan. And there is this law, Ian talked about the viability rule, but the very important one, which 99% of people misunderstand, is the 5-year housing land supply. They misunderstand it because they abbreviate it to 5-year land supply. It is not a 5-year land supply, it's a 5-year housing supply. And so if the builders do not build enough houses to meet the targets that they've been set by the district council, then they can say, we want more land then. And then the whole local plan fails and they can build in the AONB, which is what they're doing in South Oxfordshire. We had that stupid plan pushed through against our will by the government. And straight away, within 6 months, we were unable to build 1,100 houses a year. And so we lost an area of outstanding natural beauty. And then a couple of weeks later, an ancient woodland in Didcot, which is already taking 10,000 houses. It's absolutely disgusting. The rules are disgusting. All we can do is have huge societal change and rip up those laws. We cannot survive within them.
What you've just said has sort of, in some ways, made most of the other questions. I mean, it's so shocking what you've just said. Anyway, but I'll go.
What, the 5-year housing supply? Yeah. Well, at least you got it. You have to talk for hours and hours for people to
I didn't
believe it.
I haven't quite grasped it. I mean, so Barry's question is, but I think you've sort of just, when will the housing numbers be reviewed and by whom, and what power do we have to influence those? But that does sort of tie in with what you just said, I think.
Well, your local plan in the last 5 years, and then you have to do another local plan. It should last 15 years because it's set for 15 years, but the government wants to keep pumping more and more housing into the system. So this is what happened to South Oxfordshire. We had a perfectly good plan that was good for another few years, but we were told you have to have another plan and you have to double the number of houses. So what we did was we had a plan up to 2031, which was using the growth deal numbers, the 100,000 houses for Oxfordshire. And then we had 4 more years because we were so behind in getting this sorted. And they just rolled on at the same number, the same 1,100 houses a year. So, so that's how it was set this time. But now we've got Oxfordshire Plan 2050, which is coming up with these new high numbers. And if you want something to have a campaign about, it's to help CPRE, Need Not Greed for Oxfordshire, the Civic Society, Bioabundance Community Interest Company, which I run. All of those are calling for a peer review of the Oxford Growth Needs Assessment, which Ian mentioned, the OGNA, which is coming up with these absurd high numbers to carry on from 2031 up to 2050. What we should be doing is reducing from 100,000. We would have to come out of the growth deal, and we don't want these bloody roads anyway, which we were getting for it. We need to come out of the growth deal and then reduce from the 100,000, because if we build the 100,000, then it's really curtains for Oxfordshire.
I can just say, often even if you have a local plan and you've got housing numbers in that plan, it doesn't really stand you in much stead. In the case of Cherwell, which is where I kind of originally got involved Their local plan was passed in 2014, I think it was, or 2015. But inserted into it was this requirement to reassess their need once Oxford knew what their unmet need would be, which is what I mentioned in my talk, which is this idea that Oxford projects their growth out for another 10, 20 years and says, well, we're not going to be able to meet our own housing needs, which is ludicrous because they do have, and I think one of the questions in the chat was, do they not have brownfield sites to build on? Yes, they do, but they are ring fenced and they are taken out of the numbers. So they say, well, we haven't got any land. I mean, and then you look at Osney Mead, the Westgate Centre, where we've got Oxford North at the moment, and all sorts of other sites that they could build houses on, but they choose instead to build hotels, shopping centres and business parks on, which is and also student accommodation, which is quite lucrative because it's not covered by the same building regulations as normal housing. And in the case of Cherwell, because this was slipped into their plan, after 2 years of their plan running in 2017, they had to reassess their housing need. And this, because Oxford hadn't published their local plan, they still didn't know what their housing need was going to be. So what happened was the Oxfordshire Growth Board got together and basically plucked a figure out of the air, which became known as the working assumption. And gradually that working assumption was kind of validated by Oxford City Council in their local plan, even though there was evidence suggesting that this is when the schma came in during the Oxford City plan. Another report was done, which virtually by the same people who wrote it said, actually, no, we got our numbers wrong. But the City Council stepped in and essentially fudged the figures to make it look exactly like it would be how they wanted it to be, which then blew everything out of the window. The Oxford City plan was passed. That pushed another 15,000 houses onto the local districts. South Oxfordshire, I think, got 4,000, 5,000. And Cherwell got 4,400, all of which are on Greenbelt. And I think West got some, and Vale got some, and this was all under another bit of legislation, which is the duty to cooperate. So all neighbouring authorities have to cooperate with each other to meet housing needs. So there are all these little loopholes that stitch everything up to the point where you can't do anything about it really. But yeah, and as Sue says, the Ogna is the next stage in this, which is just going to push these numbers even further. And I can foresee if we don't, I mean, I brought a motion to Cherwell to challenge it, it was blocked. There is a new report floating around that has been done, independent assessment of the Ogna, which again shows that it's wrong. But if we don't challenge it and stop it, it's going to be used in future plans to push the housing numbers higher again, which means more building on Greenbelt probably, because the city just don't want to build on their own land.
Just to say on that, West Oxfordshire, I got the scrutiny committee to call for an independent review. So West Oxfordshire Council, which is, as we all know, Conservative-led, it's in a different situation to Cherwell and Oxford City, and I think there is support there for an independent review of the housing figures. So it's definitely there is a door opening there. At least one of all the councils, I think, have to agree to a certain degree, but West Oxfordshire is supportive of having a review of the housing, independent review of the housing figures.
You know, one's already been done.
Sorry?
One has already been done.
Oh yes, yeah, I did see the a truly independent review. Yeah.
You just have to councils to accept it.
You mean the need not greed one, by when you say a truly independent review?
I think so. It was done by ORS, Oxfordshire, I can't remember what that stands for, but they were the ones that did the assessment of the schma for Cherwell and for the city plan.
Ian, sorry, forgive me, but could you tell us once more what schma stands for? Because I haven't quite got it.
Strategic Housing Market Assessment.
Strategic Housing Market Assessment. Okay, so no SBNA.
And so although we already have we've all done our own independent ones, but that was a particularly full one that was shown to your council. But we need the people that we need the councils themselves, the Future Oxfordshire Partnership, which is the group of leaders of the councils. We need them to come to us and say, we ask you to do this, and then they would have to take it on board rather than this way around. So that's. But I'm glad that we're heading there. West Oxfordshire is streets ahead of Southern Vale in all respects.
So Rosie, Deborah's had a hand up for a while.
Yes, Deborah has a question.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to put the question that I put into the chat because it links in quite nicely to this, which is there any way that councils in a similar position outside of the county, together with district and county city council in Oxfordshire, could kind of unionise and collectively stand up and oppose what is ultimately being forced upon them by government? Because united we stand. It must be possible, I don't know, through the local government association or elsewhere, to find allies that could fight this together. That's kind of my question, I guess.
Andrew, what do you? Yeah,
I was just going to say that, of course, well, we haven't really talked about that. There was a planning white paper which was going to make it even easier for to have even less local authority control over the housing that was built in different areas, and that was that's been put on hold at the very least because there was a Conservative backlash against that, the number of houses that were being built. So I mean, that is kind of working in a when there's enough pressure, obviously with the Conservative government, we need Conservative local authorities to be against it, but ultimately we need a change of government because the housing figures are set centrally for the country, and the Planning Inspectorate will, I think, as was done for South Oxfordshire, I believe, Sue, they can't unilaterally change their housing figures. We need a change of government will make a big difference here. But that doesn't necessarily, if Labour aren't quite on the same page as the Greens and perhaps Lib Dems on that. So there's still work to do.
There are some groups, and there is some movement. So it's generally thought that Amersham and Beaconsfield, was it, lost the safe seat for the Conservatives because of overdevelopment. So they do have the wind up a bit, and Robert Jenrick lost his position as Secretary of State for Housing, and Michael Gove became the new Secretary of State for Housing. Now, I think that's pretty significant. There was our own battle with him, because when we did try to withdraw our local plan as the newly elected Green Lib Dem Council, to withdraw the Conservative plan, Robert Jenrick stepped in and said, I insist that you take it through to adoption. So he overturned the democratic process entirely. And that went on until we did adopt it. And then I set up Bioabundance Community Interest Company, and we attempted to sue Robert Jenrick, and we had to sue South Oxfordshire as well. That was how we needed to do this. That might have helped. It was in the national papers, so it might have helped with Jenrick's downfall. Certainly what his shenanigans he got up to on the Isle of Dogs, helping his friend Desmond to get out of paying the Section 106 obligations, or the SIL obligations that he should have had to have paid on the development that he wanted to build on the Isle of Dogs. That couldn't have helped either. Anyway, Jenrick was overthrown. Michael Gove has come in. I went to see him at a meeting that was organised by someone, big meeting, I wasn't important in it. And Gove said, we should stop worrying so much about targets. So I think he would start to dissolve that system. I think he would. He's an intelligent man, probably unlike Jenrick. And as for the 5-year housing supply, which is such a terrible situation. He said that he doesn't like it and he would like to get rid of it, or he said he didn't like it, so I presume he will get rid of it. I just wish he would move a bit faster with all this. Working with other councillors, I'm in touch with about 20 other councils through LGA training that is done for the independent group, which includes the Green Party. And we talk about this a lot. All of them are in these situations. Anywhere, particularly like us, like South Oxfordshire, which is mostly Greenbelt or AONB, and there's just a bit in between, it's particularly difficult to squeeze all these houses in. But thank you, Deborah. That's an interesting idea that we should actually, and it needs to be more than just, I mean, we've also got the Association of Green Councillors where we should be making this. I've recently, within the Green Party nationally, become the chair of the Housing Policy Working Group, because I want us to be much clearer about what our message is, which essentially should be that there should be no top-down targets, that local areas should genuinely decide for themselves. It's kind of pretended that they are, but because you produce your own local plan, but of course you have no control over what numbers are handed down to you and the formula that is handed down to you. And we should have the choice of not building at all. So I don't know where else we can work.
I mean, can I just say very quickly, ironically, I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't conservative local councillors out there who would be opposed to building on Greenbelt, but just need the courage to be able to speak out against their own councils and their own government. So I wouldn't write them off as allies potentially too, more so than we find than Labour. Shame on Labour in the city. What, why are they doing the government's business? I just don't get it.
So how do we do that, Deborah? I mean, it's a brilliant idea.
Have you any other questions?
Because of politics, everybody is so tribalised. It is really difficult to get other people to liaise with you. Yeah, we should try.
There aren't any other questions in the chat. Can I ask a question about land value tax, or is that just too big to raise at this late stage? Of any of the councillors who, perhaps Ian, I don't know.
I'm slightly ambivalent on land value tax, mainly because coming from a background of being a retailer where we were subject to quite heavy, retailers still are heavy business rates. And business rates is very similar to the way that land tax works, in that it assesses how your area should perform and how valuable your piece of land is. Very similar situation with business rates, where if you're in a popular area, you're told, well, your area is valuable, so you need to pay quite a lot of tax, even though your business may not be as successful as it's meant to be. And so that can end up squeezed. I mean, some people take the view that, well, that's your problem and you should be, squeezed out of that area then. But I sort of seen echoes of that with land tax. I think it's good on large tracts of land, which is probably more what we're talking about, where developers refuse to build on these bits of land and just sit on them as land banks. So I would certainly support it in those terms. But again, I think we'd have to be a little bit careful that we didn't then end up pushing even more development on those sites because they want to get their value back.
Is there any way then which we could take out the speculation, the peculiarly British thing of, housing being more of an investment than it is of a home? I mean, how can that be addressed through the tax system?
Well, land tax would work in association with legislation to prevent that happening, and to prevent landowners and landlords from basically just pushing that tax onto tenants and whatever. And that, I think, was part of Green Party policy, but I'm not quite sure how you would enforce that. That's the only issue. It would just happen and you wouldn't know it. That's the problem.
I went to a talk on it at the Green Party conference in 2015, and it's so complex. I didn't understand it.
It can't be any more complex than business rates, but yeah, it's a problem. I think I'm against any tax that doesn't take into account ability to pay. I think that's when it becomes inequitable. I think that's the problem.
Yes. Yeah. Andrew?
Can I ask a quick question to Ian and Sue? Well, Ian particularly. Shared ownership. I mean, a lot of people. I totally agree with you in terms of the rented sector, how it works really well in other countries. But a lot of people still say, "But I want to own my own place." And you sort of made some criticisms of shared ownership models at the moment. What do you think would work effectively in terms of shared ownership?
I'm not sure any. I can't think of any way that shared ownership is working the sort of way that it's working at the moment, in that you're sharing your ownership of that. I mean, obviously shared ownership if there was more than one person who owned a house or whatever, and you've got, I mean, that's already available. But if you're sharing your ownership with the person that owns that's built the house, which is what generally happens, there are a lot of caveats attached to those deals at the moment, where you can only buy a certain amount more in the equity, and that goes on a sort of, I'm not sure of the exact details, but it goes on a kind of escalator process. And I just think, from a purely common sense point of view, if you own, I don't know, 10, 15% of a house, and you yes, you may feel better that you think, well, I own the bathroom, or you know, I own half of my living room or something. But ultimately, when it comes to you wanting to sort of release that equity, I mean, one of the things I was going to mention is one of my real pet hates is the phrase "getting on the housing ladder." There is no housing ladder. I don't think there ever was one. If you own a house, then all houses go up in the same value. The only ladder you're on is an employment ladder. If your earnings go up, then you can afford a bigger house. It's not. There is no housing ladder. And I think the same sort of thing applies with the whole way that shared ownership is sold. It's saying, you know, you've got a little bit of a foot on half a rung of the housing ladder now, so you own a bit of a house. So isn't that great? But when you actually break that down, how would you take advantage of that ownership? I can't really see how it's going to happen. And I think there are already sort of scare stories and horror stories of people that are locked into these deals, can't afford to buy any more equity, don't want to be in this situation where they're paying rent and a mortgage, and are being effectively held to ransom by their landlord stroke freeholder. And you know, I just think it's going to end up being in sort of 10 years or probably less time. You know, were you sold a shared ownership scheme? You know, we'll come in and unpick it for you and charge you a fortune. You know, that's my concern about it, really.
Cathy's had her hand up for a while.
Cathy?
Thank you. I just want to make a few comments, actually. It's really interesting discussion, and thank you ever so much for hosting it. I'm interested. I live in Thame, and it's a 15-minute neighbourhood, and there's lots of talks of these 15-minute neighbourhoods. But all our housing that we've got around Thame, you know, the new ones that are bolted onto the town, they're all building in car dependency, as I think it was Andrew mentioned, 1.4 cars per household, even to the extent that the community land trust that is going to be built in Thame is going to be built, first of all, it's going to be built on a paddock, so it's digging up green space, which is already lovely. It's going to cross the Phoenix Trail, which is a cycling and walking path, so we're going to have cars thundering across there. 31 houses, and yet everyone who lives in that house, in those houses, would be able to walk into Thame and get it onto public transport, get on a bus to Oxford or Aylesbury, walk into Thame where we've got surgeries, we've got shops, you know, all the needs. And sadly, these are being built not only for cars, but also they're going to put in electric vehicle things, you know, for the electric vehicles. So, you know, it just seems like it's never ending. We're building, I've put in the chat a link to this car dependency report, which I really recommend people read. And it has two examples from Oxfordshire. One is Didcot and the other one is the Barton estate. And it shows how, you know, they're sort of bolted onto these roads. The bridge over the ring road in Oxford was never built for walking and cycling. And so, you know, it goes on. We just get more and more cars, which means more and more problems with transport and lots of, or not just cars, lorries, you know, what have you. So it's just those comments. So that's all.
Yeah.
From the county council.
Thank you. Oh,
what's going on there then?
Yes.
From the county council perspective, entirely agree with you. And you know, as part of the alliance, the Lib Dem Green Alliance on there, we are pushing back on that as much as we can. But unfortunately, it's a bit of an uphill struggle at the moment. We're locked into one of the things I mentioned was the Housing Infrastructure Fund, the HIF2 project, which is this 300 million, essentially a 300 million pound road going from Oxford to Didcot. Some of it is cycling, some of it, majority of it is car transport or vehicle transport, HGVs. We were sort of bequeathed it by the Tories, and it's full of all these traps that if you pull out of it, the housing deal in South Oxfordshire would collapse. And as Sue said, probably what would happen is the government would step in and say, you can't do that. Some of it is beyond my pay grade, but you know, there is a group of us on a kind of a rebel alliance within the alliance that is trying to stop this thing, you know, trying to say, we don't want to build this, we want to build light rail. But we're being told that's not possible, it's not viable, it would be too much, it'd be too expensive, blah, blah, blah. But the devil in the detail on that is that we get told we'll get, I think there's about 230 million pound funding to build this road. The other money has to come from other areas, some of it from the council itself, which also locks us into doing this and means that we can't do other things. But the real kicker is that we don't get any money to maintain the roads. The money to maintain roads is getting less and less and less. The OCC is about £30 million a year adrift in its cost in its budget for fixing the roads. The way that the Tories got around it when they were in charge is they borrowed £80 million about 4 or 5 years ago. That money's about to run out. So all the time we're giving money to build new roads, we're not giving money to fix them. Whereas if you built light rail, it would be self-funding. You charge a modest fee, you know, a modest ticket price, and it would self-fund. But we're told no, we can't do that because that's not viable. But a road is, you know, well, in a modern day where, you know, this road is going to areas like Culham, you know, cutting-edge technology companies, the best we can come up with is a big slab of tarmac and concrete.
The HIF2 roads are quite ironic, really, because of this merry-go-round of we would, one of the reasons we didn't manage to withdraw our plan before Jenrick noticed was because the Didcot councillors said that they really wanted to keep those HIF roads because Didcot deserved something nice to happen to it. And so we were told, and then there were all these negotiations supposedly happening whereby perhaps we would be allowed to withdraw the plan, which had 6,000 houses attached to those HIF roads, or perhaps we wouldn't, and it turned out that we couldn't. But I like to quote on a regular basis the Science and Technology Committee of the government, which has said that the widespread ownership of private cars is not compatible with climate change action. So this can only work by a huge societal shift. You can't push people out of their cars when we haven't got the buses. We're talking about cancelling all the buses in these post-COVID times anyway. We've got to provide the infrastructure first, the proper infrastructure, the buses, and make them as fantastic as they are in Austria before we can take people's cars away.
Can I throw in as well that ironically, house values dropped by 20% in car-free developments, which is why the City Council is so opposed to them. So that's an immediate win-win way of reducing your house prices.
It's not a win for the developers, that's the problem. I've been in meetings recently with developers around here, and they say, well, what do you want? And I say, well, are you going to be car-free? And you can see them visibly blanch. And I say, well, are you going to provide drives and garages? And then they give you all sorts of nefarious reasons why they should do that. And then and in answer to another question, can we enforce it? No, we can't. Until the government changes primary legislation, local authorities have only got very limited abilities to build these things into their local plan. I've asked for it to be included in the new Cherwell local plan for 2040, and I'm told we can't do it until the government changes its rules.
I think it is time to be winding down now. We've had a few people dropping out, and I think, Ray, are you doing a summary? Sum up? It's been an incredibly interesting evening. You're on mute. You're on mute, Ray.
Thank you. It absolutely has, and thank you. We've got 3 absolutely outstanding councillors that we feel that really truly represent us, the constituents, but we need to have more. But this conversation has really helped us when we go on the doorstep with an issue that is really central to what affects us here. And I think although the Green Party is the party that stands for social and environmental justice, a couple of issues. What is really weak are the ethics of a number of people. And there are such weak motives for creating these awful decisions. And I know they're really complex, as Sue and Ian and Andrew have clearly expressed, but there are ways that we can sometimes challenge and make change. Like Andrew mentioned, the Cogs Link Road. We can get people together and push for change. And one of the things I'd really like to see, if we could push for those restrictions that Sue mentioned, of where she highlighted the 4 times the number of houses that are being built that are actually needed. You know, it would be something that we really is worth fighting for. So thank you ever so much. And I just hope we get more councillors elected this time to come and support you.
So thank you. I'll add my thanks to that of Ray and Rosie. It's been a very interesting, instructive, and set lots of challenges for us. So thank you all. Thank you all for Ian, Sue and Andrew. Thank you, Rosie, for chairing, Ray for wrapping up.